7th of July 2017, 122 countries voted in favour of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Countries that don't have nuclear weapons, but live under their threat, voted for a ban. Without the knowledge of most of their citizens, the governments of the world's nuclear powers didn't vote, and yet the ban went ahead. Something new is happening.
To challenge the mainstream security discourse that treat these as tools of international security, the language of deterrence, treating these weapons as something that prevents conflict, instead of actually examining them for what they are.
The focus changed from tools of security and stability to human beings are destroyed. Nuclear weapons are catastrophic to humanity and catastrophic to life on this planet.
After all, it's the people who suffer, and this has been forgotten in our debate.
Now, we today have a massive body of evidence that a nuclear war would simply not only not be winnable, it would likely destroy life on Earth as we know it today.
The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was launched by people who consider that nuclear weapons produce unspeakable suffering in human beings and create an unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe.
So we established this campaign around 2006, and we felt that the specific objective needed to be a treaty that outlawed nuclear weapons completely.
So we're about 11 years old now, and was very much inspired by the campaign to ban landmines and the Cluster Munitions Coalition.
The process at the United Nations is ongoing, and 50 countries need to ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. That is not to say that nuclear weapons will disappear the next day, but it is the beginning of the end.
We Hibakusha had been waiting for the ban for 72 years. Let this be the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons.
The history of nuclear weapons is short. At the time of the Second World War, several scientists revealed that it would be possible to make an enormously powerful bomb using atomic fission. German armed forces could have succeeded in their research and come up with the ultimate weapon.
At the moment of surrender, Hitler had in the blueprint stage transoceanic rockets, which could have destroyed our city.
The US government regarded this as a matter of survival and allocated huge resources to the construction of the atomic bomb. But by the time the first test took place in the New Mexico desert, when a miniature sun announced the beginning of the nuclear age, the German army had already surrendered. The decision to use the bomb on Japanese cities was taken in a new situation, marked by the approaching end of the war and the partitioning of the world among the victorious powers. In the Second World War, armies massacred civilian populations by ruthlessly razing entire cities to the ground. These bombings anticipated the nuclear horror to come. On August 6, 1945, a uranium bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
At that moment, I saw in the window the tremendous flash. And I couldn't comprehend, but before you had a chance to comprehend what was happening, I knew my body was flying up in the air. After that, I lost consciousness. Now, when I regained the consciousness in the total darkness and silence, I knew, finally, Americans got us. Also, it happened at 8:15 in the morning. It was dark, dark like twilight. And then I began to see in the dark some moving objects, but they were so silent. They didn't look like human beings. The hair was standing up and all curled up, and skin and flesh were just falling out. Some were carrying the eyeballs in their hands, the skin and the flesh hanging. The majority of my schoolmates were working in the center part of the city. They are the first one who simply vaporized, melted. From my school, over 300 students were there. I'm alive because I wasn't there. I was somewhere else. For, 1 mile away, I was inside the building. I was buried by the collapsed building. I must have been protected. But those people had no protection directly under.
The explosion caused untold suffering, and no one could assist the wounded. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. In addition to the people who died immediately, victims would continue to die from radiation sickness for a long time to come.
So the original number of fatalities in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of 1945 was 140,000 in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki. Those figures increased between 2- and 3-fold in the next 5 years due to radiation sickness from radiation exposures.
In the first second, the white light is blinding, the heat immense. In the first day, fires consume the city and there's no way to fight them. Your skin is badly charred. In the first week, those hospitals that are still functioning are overwhelmed and can't treat the injured. Others who seem fine suddenly fall ill and die from radiation sickness. In the first year, radiation has seeped into the water and the soil. Crops and animals are contaminated. The humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are horrific and span generations. It's time to ban them now.
The use of the bomb was justified as a necessary evil to quickly bring the war to an end. But this is now questioned by historians.
Recent research shows that it's highly unlikely that the Japanese surrendered because of nuclear weapons. They surrendered because the Soviets came into the war. The night before we bombed Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declares war. It significantly changes our view of nuclear weapons writ large because Hiroshima was the first impression. It was the notion that set up all the subsequent thinking. And if we change how we think about Hiroshima, it changes everything.
From that point on, any power that did not have nuclear weapons would feel vulnerable. In subsequent years, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France and China developed their own atomic bombs in a context of confrontation between Western and Eastern blocs during a period known as the Cold War. This is also the time when the United Nations was founded in an attempt to create a forum for mediation in order to prevent conflicts from escalating into armed confrontation. Member states also signed the Charter of Human Rights, universal rights above national interests and power. However, these aspirations gave way to a harsh reality in which two superpowers dominated the planet by force and endangered it with an irresponsible arms race.
The United Nations had been working to address the threat of nuclear weapons since its foundation. The very first resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly was for the total elimination of all weapons adaptable to mass destruction. And yet it took all that time to finally put in place a total ban on the weapons.
Up to 2,000 nuclear weapon tests were carried out with increasingly powerful bombs. It has been estimated that the radiation from these tests has affected millions of people.
They had a march in Kazakhstan that was led by this Kazakh poet Olza Suleymanov, because the people in the Soviet Union were so upset in Kazakhstan. They had so much cancer and birth defects and waste in their community, and they marched and stopped nuclear testing. Gorbachev said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore.
Nuclear weapons were justified as defensive weapons. It is the doctrine of deterrence. A nuclear bomb is supposed to deter the enemy from attacking. In the case of the two Cold War blocs, mutually assured destruction was said to be the guarantor of world peace and security. Since World War II, however, there have been several occasions when confrontation has been on the verge of ending in nuclear war.
So deterrence, the notion that nuclear weapons have kept us safe during crises is simply historically inaccurate. The nuclear believers often say deterrence has been perfect because there's been no nuclear war. It's a ludicrous argument on the face of it. You say deterrence has never failed, clearly it has. If human beings are fallible and if human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence, then nuclear deterrence, by definition, is inherently flawed. It will fail. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when.
The danger of intentional use is compounded by the risk of accident. There are currently 2,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert that can be launched within minutes. In 1983, the Soviet radar system misinterpreted a cloud formation as a missile attack.
So many stories of near misses, and this Colonel Petrov from Russia, who was such a hero, he was in the missile silo and he saw something that indicated that they were being attacked by us, and he was supposed to unleash all his bombs against New York and Boston, and he waited, and it was a computer glitch. And he even got reprimanded for not following orders. It's like we're just lucky. We're living in a fantasy.
We know of at least 6 occasions when the world has come within minutes of nuclear war because deterrence failed, because one or the other nuclear weapons state, usually the United States or Russia, believed it was under attack and actually began the process of launching its own nuclear weapons, only to stop at the very last minute when the mistake was discovered. 6 times that we know about that this has happened. This is an insanely dangerous situation.
Todas aquellas herramientas, en este caso armas, que inventamos, se acaban usando. Cuando hay una probabilidad de 1 por 1000, tú dejas pasar suficiente tiempo y se produce el hecho del 1 por 1000, ¿no?
In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by the vast majority of sovereign states. It sought to restrict possession of nuclear weapons and stop their proliferation, but it did not outlaw possession by the 5 states that had already conducted tests at that time.
And 5 countries, the US, Russia, China, England, and France, promised to give up their nuclear weapons if all the rest of the world wouldn't get them. And everybody signed this treaty except India, Pakistan, and Israel, and they went and got their own bombs.
You can't have an apartheid law that treats people differently or countries differently. You have to have the same rules for everyone, otherwise it's inconsistent and it's not going to work.
Nuclear proliferation and technological progress are creating new dangers. There is a possibility that a small group could make a bomb. There is also the danger that a country with nuclear weapons could suffer internal ruptures or social unrest, and weapons would no longer be under safe control. Computer systems can also be hacked. Finally, any kind of explosion at a nuclear power plant would create massive, uncontrollable contamination.
Millions of people would be exposed to lethal doses of radiation, and tens of millions of people would be exposed to doses of radiation that would put them at increased risk for cancer should they survive the immediate post-war period. So this is an enormous problem, and one which is generally ignored completely. In the 1980s, the arms race was reaching its peak.
thousands of nuclear warheads were produced each year, reaching a total of 70,000, enough to destroy the planet several times over. Since the beginning of the nuclear age, warnings and protests from the scientific community followed one after the other and were quickly taken to the streets. In November 1961, Women for Peace were pioneers when they went on strike and publicly demonstrated and marched against nuclear weapons in 60 cities across the United States.
So women have always been at the forefront of anti-war activism. Women were instrumental in the 1960s campaigning for a nuclear weapon test ban treaty, collecting baby teeth to show the effects that atmospheric nuclear testing was having on the environment and on children and on citizens throughout the world.
In Europe, pacifists organised marches and protests against nuclear weapon bases in several countries. Some of the biggest took place in the United Kingdom, where the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament organised protest marches from 1959 and created the symbol that has remained associated with peace. In 1982, 1 million people gathered against nuclear weapons in New York. A year later, in Europe, there were massive protests in several cities, bringing some 3 million people onto the streets. The 1980s saw the possibility of a limited nuclear war in Europe, where both sides had enormous supplies of short-range nuclear weapons. Military exercises created a pre-war environment. Tension was at its height, and the social climate occasionally turned apocalyptic.
A movement in Europe, in the Soviet Union, here in North America, stopped that march to war. We reversed the Cold War arms race, and I believe that we saved the world.
But the turmoil caused by these alarms and social protests created the conditions for a succession of treaties and effective reductions in nuclear arsenals. The turning point came when Reagan and Gorbachev met twice in the mid-1980s. In the meantime, vast areas of the planet declared themselves nuclear weapon-free zones. In 1991, South Africa joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty and began dismantling its 6 bombs. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan turned over to the Russian Federation the nuclear weapons they had inherited from the Soviet Union. 5 decades since coming into force, the NPT has not fulfilled its promise to achieve disarmament.
The NPT commits states in Article 6 to nuclear disarmament, to effective measures towards nuclear disarmament.
Well, there's a loophole because it doesn't promise, like the chemical and biological weapons say they're prohibited, they're illegal, they're unlawful. The NPT just said we 5 countries will make good faith efforts, that's the language, to eliminate, for nuclear disarmament.
Se están invirtiendo miles de millones de dólares al año. Actualmente 120 mil millones de dólares al año. Estamos usando muchísima plata, la plata con la que podríamos estar librando al mundo enteramente de la hambruna, dándole educación primaria para absolutamente todo el mundo.
Currently, the 9 nuclear weapon states have almost 15,000 bombs between them, and all of them are more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The vast majority of nuclear weapons are in the hands of the United States and the Russian Federation. 5 countries host US bombs on their territories, and 28 others are involved in nuclear alliances. But most countries do not have nuclear weapons, nor do they belong to any military alliance. But they do share the risk of confrontation, even if it occurs far from their territory.
This is what re-energized so many governments, particularly in the global south, to take this issue up again. The idea that nuclear weapons do not respect borders, that even a single detonation would affect everyone, everywhere, was something that was very significant to these countries that have security interests when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Furthermore, within the UN, several countries have joined forces and managed to push through bans on different types of weapons, such as anti-personnel mines, and cluster bombs. These bans achieved success. They stopped these weapons from being manufactured and used, even without support for their ban from the military powers.
Yeah, but no one's saying that chemical or biological weapons are okay for certain countries but not others, and no one's saying that it's okay to be sheltering under a chemical weapon umbrella or a biological weapon umbrella.
All of the states party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty agreed by consensus that any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and nuclear weapons must be considered through the lens of international humanitarian law.
By 2017, the treaty had gained a lot of support. Negotiations were conducted under the leadership of Elaine White Gomez from Costa Rica.
De Costa Rica, que es un país que decidió desde hace 70 años tener un enfoque distinto hacia la paz y la seguridad, aboliendo sus fuerzas armadas. Entonces, eso implica para un país como nosotros, que nosotros pusimos toda nuestra confianza en un sistema internacional que a través de las reglas y de las instituciones podemos resolver los conflictos y los problemas de la humanidad.
Furthermore, the voices of affected human beings were heard.
Each person had a name. Each person was loved by someone. Let us ensure that their deaths were not in vain.
Estamos hablando de seres humanos que en su experiencia humana, en esta vida, han conocido los horrores de lo que estamos tratando de solucionar. Eso le dio a la conferencia un espíritu un sentido de ética y de justicia que no habría sido posible si ellos no estuvieran allí.
Well, my job is to share my experience in Hiroshima and what it means to live in nuclear age, what horror that brings to humanity, and we should never ever let that happen again to another human being. That's my message, and I can't stop talking about it. I am going to keep talking.
In July that year, 122 countries, about 2/3 of the total, voted in favour of the ban treaty. Now the treaty has to attract 50 ratifications for it to enter into force.
The treaty includes a broad range of prohibitions, a prohibition, of course, on the use of nuclear weapons, as well as the threatened use of nuclear weapons, a prohibition on testing and production of nuclear weapons, and indeed a prohibition on the possession of nuclear weapons.
I also think it's really shown the power of civil society and governments working together. We stood up to some of the most powerful, most heavily militarized countries on this planet and did something that they were forbidding us to do.
The ability to kill massive amounts of people and inflict suffering and pain on civilians is not a sign of power and prestige. It's what dictators do, it's what human rights violators do, not respectable countries that want to have a good standing in the international community. And now it's their turn to be on the outside. They're going to have to justify why they want weapons of mass destruction, why they think threatening to mass murder civilians or end us all, collective suicide, is a reasonable security strategy.
The Nobel Prize awarded to ICAN reinforced and publicised the campaign even more.
And it's such a great thing because we get to celebrate as a campaign of 500 organizations in 100 countries. And
it's a huge validation for the work that those campaigners are doing in whatever context, and really be elevated and validated for their hard work over the years.
In order for the treaty to be ratified in as many countries as possible, social pressure is paramount. The Parliamentary Pledge, the Cities Appeal, divestment campaigns, awareness raising, and mobilisation are necessary for the prohibition to take shape. And then pressure must continue until the stigmatisation of nuclear weapons ends in a real eradication.
ICAN also has what's called the Parliamentary Pledge, which is signed by over 800 parliamentarians across the world. And it's a pledge to work to bring the treaty into force in that country.
y disponemos de una red de parlamentarios, tanto en el Congreso como en el Senado, en apoyo de la campaña y de las posiciones del ICAN, ¿no? En pro del Tratado de Prohibición de Armas Nucleares, y en estos momentos están 92 parlamentarios.
So the ICAN Cities Appeal is a commitment that cities can make to endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and call on their governments to join.
Porque las bombas nucleares y los misiles están dirigidos a las ciudades, ¿no? Es una amenaza a la gente que vive en cada ciudad. Luego es misión del ayuntamiento que esté preocupado por luchar contra la violencia, defender a sus ciudadanos y a sus vecinos y vecinas frente a la amenaza nuclear.
And what Don't Bank on the Bomb does is it gives everyone a pathway to resist nuclear weapons. People might not know this, but private companies make key components for nuclear weapons. And in order for them to be able to do that, they need financing from banks and pension funds. If you have a bank account, you can do something about nuclear weapons. You can talk to your bank and ask them, do they have a policy on investment? If you have a pension fund, is your pension fund profiting from the production of nuclear weapons? And if they are, why? You have a right as a consumer, you have power to do something, to change that. And people are.
I also learned that the stigmatizing effect goes beyond law, but it also can have economic impacts, which are extremely powerful when we're dealing with the production and sale of weapons systems.
Estados Unidos cerró su última fábrica de municiones en racimo sin haber nunca firmado la Convención en contra de las municiones en racimo.
You know, the U.S. never signed the landmines treaty, but we don't make them anymore and we don't use them.
The decision to ban nuclear weapons will be a courageous one. It will change the world. There are billions of reasons why we need to ban nuclear weapons now. Each and every one of them has a name, a story, and a dream.
El tratado es una herramienta bastante potente, pero el desarme nuclear no va a llegar con la firma de un tratado. Necesitamos de un movimiento global. Necesitamos que la gente entienda, de generar conciencia a nivel de todo el mundo.
The nuclear weapon ban is a clamour that is uniting people of the world to defend themselves from the military powers. Beyond borders, a universal human nation is starting to take shape. A world without wars, without violence, human beings in harmony with the environment and with rights while building a fair economic system. It will be a world that combines the diversity of ethnicities, languages and cultures together in a beautiful mosaic.
En la historia humana estamos en permanente evolución y los cambios importantes no se dan de la noche a la mañana. Si las personas que estaban luchando por el fin de la esclavitud hubieran pensado que aprobando una ley o un tratado en un lugar muy específico no se iba a lograr, no tendríamos hoy lo que tenemos. Estamos en un proceso de transición y de cambio estructural. La comunidad internacional ya ha atravesado por esas etapas antes. Si nos vamos a la norma contra el colonialismo, se dio en momentos en que el colonialismo estaba en su máxima expresión.
One day, the nuclear age will be consigned to our memory like a bad dream that arose in a moment of fear and destruction. Once again, we are finding our way back to our historical path, and it is precisely in our setbacks and moments of confusion when an evolutionary direction appears which has been guiding us since the dawn of time. We recognize that every person's life is sacred, and we utterly reject nuclear weapons because they produce unspeakable harm and suffering in human beings.
These weapons are not, they're not a force of nature, they're not an act of God. We have built these weapons, we know how to take them apart. And I think it's important for us all to understand, no one of us is going to do this by ourselves. But if each one of us does that part of the job which is ours to do, we can be successful again as we were in the 80s, and we can save the world again. And we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, okay, I did what I was supposed to do.
We Hibaksha had been waiting for the ban for 72 years. Let this be the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons.